Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And today we're going to talk, everything we talk about today is going to be specific to dungeon players, not dungeon masters, okay? We're going to talk about dungeon masters a little bit, but only from the perspective of what players should be looking for in dungeon masters. And today we're going to talk about next level play, right? How do you get the top tier best play at your Dungeons & Dragons table, right? There's lots of good advice on there on how to be a good player, but today I'm going to talk about something I haven't talked about previously, and that is specifically buying into other dungeon players' goals. So when I say a dungeon player, I mean a player who plays Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, that's why I call him a dungeon player. Dungeon master, that's a Dungeons and Dragons dungeon master, right? Whereas all other scrub games, other than every other scrub game is like game master. Or there's a few that call it something different, but dungeon master is specific to Dungeons and Dragons, and that title, that honorific, is not used for other games because they don't deserve it. Right? And so I'm trying to get the concept dungeon player going, right? Which is a Dungeons and Dragons player, because they're not like scrub OSR players. They're a different tier of player, right? They're more important. The things they do impact lives as opposed to OSRs, which are really constrained and unimportant, and the impact of those games doesn't go beyond the fun of the people at the table. It's small, it's shriveled, it's for people who lack vision, right? But if you care about this world, if you care about society, if you care about the intellectual evolution of humanity, you play Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, all right. So let's talk about what is next level play, and that happens when you are buying into the goals of other player characters. Okay, so let's talk about this. All right. So first of all, let's talk about what type of game you should be pursuing as a dungeon master. So first of all, not all dungeon masters are of equal rank. There is a hierarchy of Dungeons and Dragons games from worst to best. Okay, what is the worst dungeon master platform you can be in? Right, I'll tell it to you right now. The worst dungeon master platform you can be in is any dungeon master who is there for the deity powers of the dungeon master slot. Right, you can smell these people. Basically, we have a real problem in Dungeons and Dragons, which is the dungeon master slot is the god slot, right? And so so anytime you are here's some good examples, right? If you get into a game and your dungeon master is controlling your character, right? Dungeon masters control the weather, they control every NPC, they control every element of the world. The only things they need to keep their hands off is your player character, right? But you could tell the worst dungeon masters because they try to control player characters, right? They jump in and they're like, oh, I'd like to, I've pre-generated your character. You don't need to roll you. That is run for the hills if somebody's asking you to play a pre-generated character. They're literally saying, you only control one thing in this game, and I'm going to take that control from you. Run for the hills, right? I do character generation even in con games. That tells you how serious I am about character generation, right? I'm very, very adamant about this, right? All right, so basically, anytime you get a whiff that your dungeon master literally loves the god seat and is not there to discover, to find out what happens, but to fulfill this, something that they wrote, that's a problem, okay? Actually, specifically, if you get the idea that your dungeon master wants the power of the dungeon master slot, and really that it's their number one concern, run for the hills. It is the worst game, and it doesn't matter what they're running. It doesn't matter. You're going to have I think it's the worst game. And actually, I'm not even going to say you're going to have a bad time. I'm saying it's the worst Dungeons & Dragons game you could be in, right? All right, and that goes also, it's a tough life, where a lot of times people who want leadership are the worst leaders, right? It's it's rough. Now, with that said, yeah, it's a whole thing. All right, next, the dungeon master who comes to the table with their own pre-generated story, and they're going to drag you through it, right? They've written their own adventure, right? It's bad. And it is the second to worst type of Dungeons and Dragons game. Okay, the third is any of the official Dungeons & Dragons adventure. It's very bad. It's like your dungeon master is saying, I'm too lazy to run my own stuff, right? To make my own stuff. Or they're like, it's a pre-generated. It's pre-generated dungeons are fundamentally railroading. They have to be, right? Because it's just the crap in the book. That's the only place you can go. And once you're outside of that, the dungeon master, well, what is the point of even using this pre-generated, right? And it requires people to buy into completing the adventure, which I don't like. I don't like that, right? Then finally, the top tier best dungeon master experience that you can get as a player, and this is where you should try to be, is dungeon masters who are using your backstory as the primary spark for the world, right? They're open to having a good or even a very long backstory, and then they're going to craft their world around you, the rock star of the game, the player character. These are very rare games, but they're the best you could be. Now, let's say you land in the best game you could be in, and now everybody at the table, your dungeon master is writing 1 page of content for every session, right? Comes to the table and is like, I got the whole DMG, I'm just setting up the pins, you're knocking them down, you determine direction, you, the player characters, determine the direction of this game. I don't have an overarching story that I'm trying to fulfill. We're going to find out what adventure your adventurers get up to, right? It's the best top tier play you can get. It's very rare, but if you find yourself there, okay, here's how you can make that game even better and reach top tier play, all right? So first of all, at this point, I'm dealing with this in my game right now, right? I got 2 players. They both have noble house backgrounds, right? And one of the player characters actually talked to another, talked and said, here's my character, and I really want here's my character, and here's my character background, and explained it to the dungeon master, and got things rolling, right? But now I have another player character who also is part of a noble house in the same city, right? And I saw top tier play, right? This one player was like, I got the same background as this other person, but I'm just going to let it flow, right? I'm going to let this entire story arc happen with this other player, right? And this player, who had the same background as the other player, sacrificed and said, I'm going to buy in to this other player's goals. And this other player, basically, they were a noble house, but they were estranged from the house, right? And so we spent literally like 2 or 3 sessions watching as the player character who was estranged from their house was reunited with their house and became an honored member of their house again, right? But in order for this to happen, the other player had to shut their story down and really say, hey, my story may never be highlighted like this, right? So basically, I need to let this other player have the highlight. And so one of the things they did was when we went to the noble house of the story character, the character whose story was being highlighted, right? They were like, hey, I'm going to be, they went there, and I said, when you guys are received, the person who is, whose story is being told here, when they're received in the house, you other 2 player characters, you guys are positioned behind them as servants. You look like a servant. So here we have a player who's from a noble house. We have another character who's of a noble house. They're both princes, right? Like one is a princess, one is the other prince, but they're at the same noble level, right? And one of them is standing back and taking the position of a servant, right? Because this isn't their house, right? And so even though they are a prince and should be standing at equal level, right? In order for this other player's story to be told, right? For the backstory to become the main story of the entire campaign, right? The other person had to sacrifice, and that is top tier play, right? And that's when you get real shine, right? So like the one player went through this really cool tabletop role-playing game experience and really had a dramatic very awesome story arc, right? But another player just really kind of sat back and took it in the teeth, right, from a neglect perspective, while this other person's story shone, right? And they were doing the work of the best player, right? When they're like, I'm going to sacrifice for the game. I'm going to let this matter. I'm going to let this really become something special. And I am really going to sacrifice to make this game. So when we as player characters buy into another player character's goal, right, and put our own backstory in the distance and say, I know just from the nature of narrative that we're not going to get everything we need, we're not going to get everything we want, and I need to step back and let this happen, right? That is, that's what I'm saying is the best stories, right? The best things in life come from sacrifice. And the reality is when we as player characters sacrifice to let another player character shine, right? That's where you're going to get next tier play, right? And I know it's not super fun to be the one who has to sacrifice. And there's really no more legitimate reason that you should have to sacrifice than that somebody else should have to sacrifice. So why then should you sacrifice? Well, you're the one who knows to, right? The other person doesn't know yet that sacrifice is the greater play level, right? If you're listening to this channel, you're close, right? You're actually care about your game and you want to make it better, right? Unless you're like a one-time player or a one-time listener reviewer, which is okay. Welcome. So that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing and have a wonderful millennium.